You're not struggling in any way you could explain to someone if they asked. Nothing is broken. Nothing has collapsed. By every external measure, things are mostly fine. And yet, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary day, there's a feeling, vague, persistent, impossible to place, that you're somehow living slightly adjacent to your own life. There's a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You're around people regularly, you have conversations, you make plans, you show up, and somewhere inside all of that, inside the jokes, the surface exchanges, the comfortable routines of being someone other people recognize and respond to, there's a level of yourself that hasn't been spoken out loud in longer than you can clearly remember, not because you've been hiding it, more because the channel for that kind of thing was never really built, and you've never been fully certain it was supposed to be, so it stays interior, accumulates quietly. And you keep moving because that's what you do, because stopping to address something you can't even name feels less like self-awareness and more like a problem without a solution. Most men carry something that isn't grief exactly, and isn't depression exactly, and isn't loneliness in the way that word is usually meant. It's more like a low-level background signal, a persistent awareness that there are parts of your inner life that are fully developed, fully present, and have nowhere to actually go. Feelings that formed completely and then just stayed. Not because you suppressed them deliberately, but because expressing them would have required a context that didn't exist, a conversation that was never offered, a version of masculinity that had room for that kind of thing. And so you got good at something else instead, at functioning, at being reliable, at being the person in the room who doesn't add emotional weight to whatever is already going on. You became, without deciding to, very skilled at carrying things without anyone needing to know you were carrying them, which mostly works. Until the carrying starts to cost more than it used to. Friendship does something specific to men over time that rarely gets examined. In your 20s, maybe even into your 30s, proximity created connection, shared spaces, shared routines, built-in reasons to be in the same room. And within that proximity, something real existed, even if it was rarely spoken directly. You knew who had your back. You knew who you could call. The closeness didn't need to be articulated because it was structural. Then the structure changes. People move, get married, have children, get consumed by work. And the closeness that was built into the architecture of daily life suddenly requires active maintenance. Which means it requires initiation, vulnerability, the willingness to say something like, "I miss talking to you out loud to another man," without the shared context that used to make that unnecessary. Most men don't make that call. Not because they don't feel it, but because the version of friendship they were taught, one built on doing things together rather than saying things to each other, doesn't have a clear mechanism for that moment. And so, the friendships thin, slowly, without conflict, without a reason, until you look up one day and realize that the people you'd call in a crisis are fewer than you thought. And the last time you had a conversation that felt genuinely real with another man was longer ago than you're comfortable admitting. There's a specific experience that lives somewhere in the territory of heartbreak but arrives without the dramatic cause. It's the feeling of having given something real to a relationship, not just a romantic one, any relationship where you were actually invested, and having it end or thin or shift without anyone acknowledging the weight of that. Because men are not typically offered a public emotional vocabulary for loss that doesn't involve something obvious. There's no cultural container for the grief of a friendship you outlived or the quiet disappointment of realizing someone you thought knew you actually knew a carefully managed version of you. So that sits somewhere, too, in the interior, with everything else. And here's what starts to feel strange when you look at this accumulation honestly. It's not that the emotions aren't there. They're there, fully, precisely there. It's that the path from feeling to expression has so many unspoken conditions attached to it. Be measured, be relevant, don't require anything. Don't be a burden, that most of the time the feeling just recycles internally without ever completing its arc. You feel it, and then you manage it, and then you move on. And the moving on looks from the outside like being fine, which is its own kind of loneliness, being read as okay when the accuracy of that reading depends on how little you've revealed. None of this is dramatic. That's precisely why it goes unaddressed for so long. There's no crisis that forces examination, no external symptom that makes it undeniable. Just a steady accumulation of unexpressed interior life and the low-grade cognitive overhead of maintaining a version of yourself that has to keep all of it running in the background. And underneath all of it, there are 5 specific patterns, 5 distinct struggles that show up in different forms in almost every man who's been carrying this kind of weight, often without realizing that what they're experiencing has any shape at all. In the next part, we're going to start looking at what those actually are, not as categories, not as a checklist, but as a real examination of what they feel like from the inside. Because the reason these struggles stay silent isn't that men don't have the capacity to understand them. It's that nobody has ever described them in a way that felt like the actual experience. That's what comes next. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. At some point, without any deliberate decision, you started presenting a slightly reduced version of yourself in most situations. Not a fake version, not a performance, exactly. Just a version with certain frequencies removed. The parts that are harder to explain, harder to justify, harder to have received without changing the dynamic of whatever relationship you're trying to maintain. You left those in. You just stopped surfacing them unprompted, and over time, the reduced version became the default. The one that shows up automatically, that people know, that feels, most of the time, like enough. The strange part is, you can't always remember clearly what got removed. You know something is held back. You can feel the boundary of it. But the contents on the other side of that boundary have become a little unfamiliar, even to you. Like a room in the house you've stopped going into so regularly that you're no longer completely sure what's still in there. There's a specific kind of social exhaustion that men almost never name because it doesn't fit any available category. It's not introversion. It's not social anxiety. It's not being tired of people in any general sense. It's the exhaustion of being in rooms where the version of you that's welcome is narrower than the version that actually exists, where the conversation stays at a register that's comfortable for everyone and you participate fully, genuinely, without any dishonesty, and yet leave feeling subtly drained by the gap between the exchange that happened and the one that was, in some vague sense, possible. You can't complain about it. Nobody did anything wrong. The people in those rooms like you, care about you, would probably say the conversation was good, and they'd be right by the available measure. It's just that the available measure doesn't account for the particular cost of being liked for a version of yourself that only goes so deep. Something happens to a man's relationship with his own emotional life after years of operating this way. It doesn't become numb exactly. The feelings are still there, accurate and present and real. But there's a delay that develops, a lag between experiencing something and knowing what you actually experienced. You'll be in the middle of something, a conversation that affected you, a moment that meant something, a situation that left a mark. And the processing of it happens hours later, sometimes days, at night usually. when there's nothing else demanding the surface of your attention. And by then, there's no context for it anymore. No one to say it to, no natural opening, no version of the conversation where bringing it up wouldn't feel disproportionate to the moment that passed. So it joins the backlog, processed privately, filed internally, never quite completed, and you get very good over time at a kind of unfinished emotional accounting. Ledgers that balance roughly, that function well enough, but that have entries that have been sitting open for years. There's a memory-like quality to certain interactions that's hard to describe without sounding like you're overstating it. You'll be somewhere unremarkable, in a work conversation, in a group setting, in a moment that doesn't ask anything significant of you. And something will briefly surface, a recognition almost, of a version of yourself that used to feel more continuous with who you are now, that had less distance between the interior and the exterior, that was less managed and more immediate. It doesn't last long. You don't dwell on it. But the flash of it is quietly disorienting because it suggests that the current baseline isn't the original one. That something narrowed somewhere, and the narrowing has been going on long enough that you've calibrated to it as normal. You don't talk about that, not because you're actively avoiding it, just because there's no social architecture for that kind of conversation. No moment in a typical interaction where mentioning it would land as anything other than strange. One of the quieter struggles in all of this is how it affects the experience of being known. Most men have people in their lives who care about them. Friends, family, partners, colleagues who would describe the relationship as close. And within those relationships, something real exists. Genuine affection, genuine history, genuine goodwill. But there's a specific kind of being known that requires the other person to have encountered something unguarded in you at least once, something you didn't prepare for them, something that arrived without editing. For a lot of men, that encounter has happened rarely or not at all with the people currently in their lives, not because intimacy is absent, but because the mode of intimacy that's been practiced, shared activities, shared history, reliable presence, doesn't necessarily require or produce that particular kind of exposure. And so there's a version of being cared for that's genuine and also slightly incomplete. You are known. Just not all the way. And the gap between those two things is something you're probably so accustomed to that you've stopped registering it as a gap. What makes this harder to address than it might seem is that nothing about it announces itself as a problem. It feels like a personality. It feels like being private, being self-sufficient, being the kind of person who doesn't need a lot of emotional maintenance from others, which are all, on their surface, neutral or even positive traits. The reframing into something worth examining requires noticing that the same behaviors that look like self-sufficiency from the outside can produce, from the inside, a very specific kind of quiet isolation. Not dramatic, just persistent, and slightly wearying in a way that doesn't respond to rest. Something is underneath all of this that's worth naming. Not a flaw, not a failure, not something that happened to you that you need to unpack. Something more structural. A pattern with a specific architecture, built for specific reasons, maintained by forces that have been running so long they're almost invisible. What that architecture actually looks like, where it came from, and why it's so quietly resistant to simply relaxing with age. That's what starts to become visible in the next part. There's a moment in almost every man's development, not a dramatic one, rarely a single event, where a very specific lesson got absorbed, not from a lecture, not from anything that could be recalled as a teaching, just from watching what happened when emotional experience was expressed too openly. What happened to the boy who cried? What happened to the one who admitted fear or hurt or uncertainty in the wrong company at the wrong age, in the wrong context. The feedback was swift, and it didn't need to be cruel to be effective. Sometimes it was just silence. Sometimes it was a slight shift in how you were treated afterward. A subtle reclassification from someone who had it together to someone who didn't. And something in you registered that shift, drew a conclusion from it, and made a quiet adjustment. Not because you were weak, because you were paying attention. That adjustment became a habit. The habit became a personality. And the personality has been mistaken ever since for something innate. Here's the uncomfortable part of that. The traits that formed around that early conditioning, the self-containment, the capability, the being, someone who handles things, they're not false. They're genuinely yours now. They've been practiced and refined and integrated for long enough that they're real, functional, and in many ways valuable. You are those things. That's not the problem. The problem is what got classified somewhere along the way as incompatible with those traits. Uncertainty, neediness, emotional exposure, the visible experience of struggle. These didn't just become things you kept private. They became things that felt on some level like threats to the identity that was built to replace them. So the self-containment isn't just a habit, it's also a defense. And defenses, by nature, don't distinguish between genuine threats and things that only feel dangerous because of old information. There's a specific internal contradiction that lives inside this, and it's one that most men carry without ever quite articulating it. On one side, a genuine need to be known. Not broadly, not by everyone, but by someone. A hunger for at least one relationship where the full version, the unmanaged version, the one with the uncertainty and the things that don't have easy resolution, is something that can exist without changing how you're perceived. That need is real. It's not weakness. It's a fundamental human requirement that didn't get exempted from your psychology just because you got good at not showing it. On the other side, a deep reluctance to actually test whether that kind of knowing is available, because testing it requires revealing something unguarded, which requires tolerating a period of exposure before you know how it will be received, which carries the specific risk of the response being not rejection exactly, but recalibration, a shift in how you're held by that person, a reclassification from someone with the qualities they valued to someone who has needs, which feels, beneath all the reasonable explanations, like losing something that can't be recovered. So the need stays, and the test never happens, and the containment continues. Not because you chose it this morning, but because the original logic of it was established so long ago, it doesn't require choosing anymore. It just runs. What gets quietly lost inside that containment is something worth looking at directly. Not the dramatic things, not the big conversations that never happened, not the relationships that could have gone deeper. Those are real, but they're visible enough to be accounted for. What gets lost in the smaller register is the ongoing experience of your own emotional life as something that matters in real time. Not historically, not in retrospect, but right now, as it's happening. When feelings consistently get routed into private processing rather than lived expression, something shifts in the relationship to them. They start to feel like interior weather you observe and manage rather than experience. You watch yourself feel things from a slight distance. You note the feeling, assess its relevance, determine its appropriate disposition, and move on. The actual residency inside the experience, the full unmanaged inhabiting of what's happening, gets shorter and shorter until it's barely there. And then, somewhere in your 30s or 40s, you realize you can't fully remember the last time you were just inside something without simultaneously managing it, without the observer running quietly alongside the experience, monitoring, adjusting, containing. That's not numbness. Numbness would be simpler. It's more like a very precise distance. A distance you've been maintaining for so long, it started to feel like the correct relationship to your own inner life. There's another layer underneath this that's harder to reach. Somewhere beneath the self-containment and the managed expression and the distance from interior experience, there's a question about worth that never gets asked out loud because it's too exposed to ask, even internally. Something like, would the unmanaged version actually be receivable? Not in a catastrophic sense, not as a fear of total rejection, but as a genuine, quiet uncertainty about whether what's underneath the capable surface is something another person would find worth staying near. That uncertainty doesn't announce itself. It shows up as preference, as simply preferring to handle things alone, as not wanting to burden anyone, not wanting to make things heavier than they need to be, not wanting to introduce emotional weight into relationships that are currently running smoothly. All of which are reasonable, considerate, even mature-sounding explanations for something that, followed far enough down, is actually a question about whether you're worth the wait. Most men never follow it down that far. The reasonable explanations are convincing. They're also, by design, stopping points. What shifts, when you actually look at this structure clearly, isn't the structure itself. That doesn't dissolve through recognition. But something in the relationship to it changes. You stop experiencing the containment as who you are and start being able to see it as something you built. Something constructed under specific conditions for specific reasons that has been running on the original specifications ever since. And built things, unlike innate things, have a different quality when you look at them directly. They have edges, they have reasons, they have a before. Seeing that doesn't make anything easier immediately, but it does make something different possible. Something that starts with looking at the pattern from outside it rather than living entirely inside it as though it were just the shape of a life. That different possibility, what it actually opens and what it quietly asks of you, is where we go next. There's something disorienting about seeing a pattern clearly for the first time when you've been living inside it for years. It doesn't feel like discovery. It feels more like suddenly noticing the hum of a machine that's been running in the background so long you stopped registering it as sound. It was always there. You adapted to it. And now that you can hear it, you can't quite go back to not hearing it, which is not the same as knowing what to do with it. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. But the hearing itself is something. Because unnamed things can only be managed. Named things can, at least in theory, be engaged with differently. The first thing that tends to shift when the structure becomes visible is the relationship to the self-containment itself, not the behavior. That doesn't change overnight, and expecting it to would be its own form of pressure. But the way you hold it internally starts to change. It stops feeling like a neutral feature of your personality and starts feeling like a position, something you're maintaining. And positions, unlike personalities, can be questioned without threatening the whole structure. That's a smaller shift than it sounds. But for someone who has spent years experiencing their own emotional restraint as simply who they are, noticing that it's also something they're actively doing, in every room, in every relationship, with every person they haven't allowed all the way in, that noticing has weight. It doesn't dissolve the behavior, it just adds a new layer of awareness to it. And that layer changes things quietly over time in ways that are hard to predict from the beginning. Something else becomes visible once the original conditioning is seen for what it was, the cost of it. Not in a grievance sense, not as an accounting of what was taken or what you missed. More as a clear-eyed recognition of what the system required in exchange for what it provided. What it provided was functional, stability, a coherent identity, the capacity to be relied on, the experience of being someone who could handle things. Those aren't nothing. They're genuinely valuable. But the exchange required rooting a significant portion of your interior life away from expression indefinitely, required maintaining a version of yourself that was always slightly on duty, required spending years being cared for in ways that felt real and also slightly incomplete because the person being cared for had been curated in advance. Seeing that exchange clearly, without contempt for the version of yourself that made it, is different from justifying it. It's just accurate. It's what actually happened. There's a specific quality to the clarity that emerges from this kind of seeing that's worth staying with for a moment. It's not relief. It doesn't arrive with a sense of things having been resolved. It arrives more like the feeling of having finally correctly identified something that had been slightly misread for a long time. The exhaustion that you attributed to work, or to external pressure, or to simply being someone who runs high. Some of that was those things, but some of it was the ongoing overhead of the containment. The processing cost of being constantly slightly more managed than the actual moment required. That recognition doesn't eliminate the exhaustion, but it relocates its source, and a misattributed weight is harder to put down than an accurately identified one, because you can't adjust what you haven't correctly named. What tends to become quietly available after this kind of seeing is not a new way of being, but a new kind of noticing. Small moments during ordinary days where you catch the managed version engaging when nothing is actually at risk, where the restraint is running on old logic in a current situation that doesn't require it, where the person in front of you, the friend, the partner, the colleague, is actually available for something less curated, and the only thing preventing it is a system that was calibrated for different conditions and never got updated. In those moments, something becomes briefly possible that wasn't possible before. Not because you decided to be different, but because you can see the gap between the situation and the response. And in that gap, there's occasionally a choice. Small, uncomfortable, easily avoided. But there. Most men won't take it every time. That's not a failure. The pattern is old and the alternative is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things carry a weight of their own. But sometimes, in the right moment, with the right person, the original sentence doesn't get redirected. The question gets asked, the admission gets made. Not dramatically, just honestly. And the strange thing, when that happens, is how rarely the response is what the old conditioning predicted. How often the other person meets it rather than reclassifying you for it. How frequently the exposure that felt dangerous turns out to produce something closer to the connection that was missing. Not always, not reliably enough to make the risk feel safe, but often enough that the original data starts to look like what it actually was. Old, accurate once in a specific environment and held past its expiration date through sheer continuity of habit. None of this is a resolution. The struggles described across this video don't resolve through understanding alone. They're too old and too structural for that. But they do become, slowly, something you're in a different relationship with. Less automatic, less invisible, less mistakable for the fixed shape of who you are. You were never broken for having built this. You were responding, intelligently, to what the environment around you rewarded and what it punished. The building made sense. The question that starts to open now is simply whether the original blueprints still fit the life you're actually living. That question doesn't demand an immediate answer, but something in you already knows it's been waiting there, quietly, for longer than you've been willing to look at it directly. If any part of this landed somewhere specific for you, the containment, the delayed processing, the friendships that thinned without a reason, the question underneath the self-sufficiency, I'd want to hear it. Not the polished version, just what's actually true. Leave it in the comments. Because one of the quietest things about the struggles in this video is how thoroughly they convince you that you're the only one carrying them. You're not even close. So, Which part of this felt most like something you've never quite had words for?